Right. Well, I want to hedge a little bit about what I've been saying. I do suspect that the future will ultimately mean asset price inflation, but you're not going to see inflation in the price of goods and services. And that's what drills me with the frustration about all this. What do you guys remember the credit crunch that happened during the financial crisis? What happened when credit contracted and everything? It became difficult to get a loan. And when it becomes difficult to get a loan, what do? You know, you just bite the bullet, basically. You don't get the loan and you don't buy the thing that you were going to buy with the loan. So if it becomes difficult to get an auto loan, for instance, you just decide not to go with a car. You decide to go without. Now, what kills me in the frustration about all this is that high debt levels increase the risk that somebody is, or enough somebodies, are just not going to make the payments on the debt. The counterparty on those debts are people and parties like Visa, MasterCard, you know, Fannie Mae, because it's an everything bubble that we're looking at, as a consequence of all the debt. Now, if I'm a bank, right, and hypothetically, I've been making loans to people, and at some point, one of my accountants comes up, and he's looking at me, and he's seeing what's going on, and he's looking at these loans, and he's like, "We got to do something with these because these are big, stinky, bad loans, and the people that are behind them have stopped making payments on them, and everything, and we got to do something with it." Now, during the financial crisis, they bundled all this shitty debt, into these, packages, and then they sold it onto the market, to widows and orphans and, people in, you know, uh, in Scandinavian villagers and everything, anybody that really wanted a high, quality, safe, supposedly investment in something. And, since housing prices would always go up, which mirrors the faith that, prices, once they go up, they never go back down. It strikes me as the same argument as housing prices will always go up. It's not that different, really. Once prices go up, they never come back down. Yeah, that article of faith is no different than the article of faith before the financial crisis, that housing prices would always keep rising. You know. Anyways, what happens at the bank when all those shitty loans come in? Now, maybe some of them will bundle them into packages and sell them to investors, and to some extent, and sell those off into the credit markets where people buy in order to collect on those debts, because they've gone bad. But they'll try to mix some of them in with good ones and everything, and create, AAA tranches, BBB, and the rating agencies became whores because, essentially, if they didn't give them a good rating, they would stop taking their business to them. And so they created a situation where, the rating agencies became completely crooked and everything. If they didn't give them an AA rating, they would just take it to the other, place, and they would lose that business. And so they started to become corrupted, and you had, an incestuous and toxic, immoral hazard and relationship that existed between the two people. And so the ratings didn't mean fuck all as a consequence. And this is all available in the subprime primer, that simplifies this so normal people can understand what's going on. But what really grinds at me about all of this inflationista talk is that at the bank, what they're going to do is they're going to be like, well, a bunch of those loans went bad, so, we're going to tighten our lending. We're going to cut back on the number of people that we're giving loans to, and we're going to make more stringent requirements and expectations from people of information that they have to give us before we will agree to give them a loan. We're going to be more selective about our clients that are coming in the future. We're not going to lend as much to subprime borrowers. Now, if I look out there, I can see grocery prices are high, right? But I can also see that there's been an irresponsible generation of people that have pushed themselves into massive levels of debt, and some of them have probably more or less not financed the increase in the price of groceries on credit cards, which, you know, makes me wonder to myself how prices can stay this elevated when household debt is as high as it is. Now, at the bank, they're going to tighten lending practices, which, you know, another aspect of this is that Japan is the test case for this. Now, recently, the carry trade, where they would buy they would borrow money in order to buy U.S. Treasury, U.S. bonds, basically from the U.S. government and everything, and push that money into that, and that will now begin to unwind because of the fact that their rates are going up in Japan. But the the frustration with that, I mean, that's going on and everything. But before that, before this recent round, we had 30 years of debt to GDP being, as the Bitcoiners say, debt to GDP had gone to the moon, basically. And so it was sky high. It was as high as the moon. It had mooned and everything. And yet Japan was in a deflationary lost decade, or lost decades, that hit Japan. It just, money wasn't moving around in the system, and yet they owed a huge amount of money to the world, and yet prices keep falling. And I believe the United States is slowly building towards this kind of crisis. We're not there. We've got a government that's trying to inflate its way out of the trouble that it's in. It's trying to debase and destroy the currency, but at the same time, you've got debt levels in the private sector that effectively mean that there has not really been a collapse in the supply of goods and services, and people are in huge amounts of debt, which means they're going to have to cut back. And this isn't coming from the sector of it isn't coming from the government. It's coming from households that took on credit card debt, took on auto loans and student loans and all this other shit and everything, and they spent it on that. And when they're this indebted, right, at some point they're going to have to start paying down the debts, or they have to let their credit rating be destroyed, and then they can't take on more debt until they pay the debt that they do have off. Well, anyways, the nature of the frustration that I feel in everybody else's analysis of all this is that they talk about credit getting tighter and all of this stuff because of the unwinding of the Bank of Japan and all this other stuff, and it's like, you don't get it. Japan is the test case scenario for a highly indebted government not being able to inflate its way out of trouble. It is really what it is. That's what happened to Japan. Japan was in massive amounts of debt, and it wanted to create inflation because inflation is growth, and it also erodes, against the debt that they owe, and makes it less valuable. And by debasing their currency, they could, for one, boost exports to the rest of the world, and for two, they could, essentially mean that their bondholders got paid with money that was worth less than it would be if they had continued to be restrictive about their monetary policies. And yet, in reality, what had happened in Japan was a deflationary scenario, despite the mooned, debt to GDP ratio that was like three times more debt than they were producing in the GDP. So when that money stops being lent to the bondholders and it goes over to their side, that still isn't going to have an inflationary consequence in the United States, because, again, for it to have any impact at all inside the United States, the counterparty on that bond would have to go out and spend that money on goods and services. And yet that's not what they're doing. They're getting out of U.S. Treasury bonds and into the Bank of Japan bonds. Money is moving around on asset sheets, on portfolio sheets. It is not moving around in the real economy. it's not being spent chasing the inventory for goods and services that are out there. And so it doesn't have any inflationary effect because it doesn't increase the circulation of money in the system. And that's what grinds me. I don't know what the future looks like. I don't know if I'm right. I don't know. I really just don't. What I see is a system that has become incredibly fragile, has less margin for error and everything, and is in a situation where, despite the fact that the government is trying to spend and spend and spend and spend and behave incredibly fiscally irresponsible, at the end of the day, you have a problem in that the velocity of money went into free fall back in 2007 and has not recovered since the financial crisis, the great financial crisis hit. The GCFS, went into motion and it caused a collapse in the velocity of money. And now, you have a system where, you had 3 rounds of quantitative easing, and some people say there was a fourth, not really, it was kind of a unofficial fourth that happened, and with some other situation. But anyways, you had these massive amounts of quantitative easing, and yet the value of the dollar stayed relatively constant. No collapse in it, and I mean that is basically a good soft landing scenario. But it signals that something is very wrong with the analysis that we're seeing out there here on YouTube and what people are saying, because the Fed tripled the money supply, and have prices for goods and services tripled since 2007? No, they really haven't. I mean, they've gone up, but not by as much as the expansion in the empty money supply. So it's out of proportion, and that means that some considerable amount of free lunch has been found in that expansion of the money supply. Because you expanded the money supply, and yet you didn't see as much inflation as in proportion to how much you expanded it by. It wasn't like a 1-for-1 ratio. It was like, I don't know what it was, but I'd have to go out and add the inflation from all the years together and show you, this, and I don't really want to do that math at the moment because I'm a little bit tired, and but I keep seeing videos that are like, this is a threat to the value of your currency. The government is just going to go keep further and further into debt and everything, and yet, I mean, this represents a fundamental misunderstanding of why the dollar, has decreased in value over all this time. Like, it's because people are, for one, the velocity of money hasn't completely disappeared. People are, it is ultimately still changing hands and everything, but it's slowing down, and it's been, it really hasn't recovered at all, really, anything close to what it was before the great financial crisis hit way back in 2007. And so you have, a situation in the velocity of money where there's been a slight uptick, that started when the virus hit and, the supply chain seized up. But, if I'm at the bank and, I see what's going on, and maybe the yen carry trade starts to collapse and everything, well, that still doesn't ultimately lead to any increases in the velocity of money. And so a scenario can develop. It is hypothetically possible that a scenario develops where there is basically a severe liquidity crisis, despite the fact that the government is in massive amounts of debt. And that liquidity crisis means that, people still need the currency, and there isn't enough of it circulating in the system, despite the fact that the system is in massive amounts of debt, which means that demand for that underlying currency goes up rather than down. And I mean, this is what happens in a credit crunch. If you can't borrow money from the bank, then obviously if I've got a lot of money in my bank account at that point, you're probably going to be hitting me up, begging me to lend the money that I've got to you, because the bankers won't. And, I'm going to want some kind of collateral from you so that, if you don't pay me, I get to keep it, and everything, and my interest, as a consequence for all that, which means that I get something from you in order to lend you that money and everything, and I get the benefit of it. And there is suddenly demand for dollars at that point, in people that might only have foreign currencies and everything. They will pour into the dollar because when they look at it, despite the fact that money is going really, really, the debt to GDP is really, really high, and all these supposedly negative factors are sky high, what they're going to see is, essentially that the debt to GDP may be high, but the velocity of money has gone into free fall, and the dollar has not really lost most of its value. It's because it's freezing up. It's not circulating. It's basically getting stuck. And there are all these things that are called liquidity traps. The money, like the new money that's in the system, is largely parked somewhere. And it's not being spent into the real economy and the velocity of money has collapsed, and that's why things are the way that they are. You've had massive rounds of quantitative easing, and everybody panicked. They panicked for the exits from the dollar. They went and sprung for their hedges. They were like gold, Bitcoin, and everything. And I'm not saying that a deflationary scenario like gold and silver and Bitcoin are the worst places to have your money parked by any shot of the imagination. Because in a deflationary crisis, those assets tend to depreciate, but they don't tend to depreciate as much as, say, like the price of milk would. Like they're basically some of the most healthy kids in a system that is immensely sick. But of course, the dollar is king in a deflationary crisis. And I think that it's this way because most of us have only, right, well, even me, I've only lived through inflationary scenarios. I've never seen deflation in my life. I haven't, but I've spent a good amount of my life studying liquidity shocks and what happens in them, and studying things, like the Great Depression and what happened in it and during the Great Depression. And what I can tell you is the 1930s crisis was the last time the United States went through, a deflationary scenario. The stock market plummeted and everything, and, banks failed and everything, and so it became difficult to get credit because there are no more banks, and so you can't use that credit to build businesses and all this other stuff, that went wrong back in the 30s and everything. And we're in a similar situation because in the run-up to it, massive amounts of debt, all over the place. And that's what grinds me, is that people, they're like, the panicking about fiat currency has not died down. Now, maybe you're right. Maybe over the long run, all fiat currencies will go to zero, as they say. Maybe, but they're not going to go to zero within my lifetime, so I have no reason to give a fuck. In the long run, all of us are dead, so we don't need to care what happens to the dollar in the ultra long run. And, that stated and everything as the argument here, what that means, is in essence, in the short run, you have a scenario where credit is going to tighten up, where it's going to get difficult to get loans, where a lot of the money that has been taken on in debt will not be paid. A lot of the money that people were expecting to get paid will never show up, which leads to a liquidity crisis, because that debt basically means that there is money that people are expecting. Somebody, the banker or the Visa, is expecting to get paid. And if it never gets paid, well, they're short something. They're missing something that they expected. And when that happens, it's always unexpected, because they expected people to make their payments on time and they didn't. Somebody's credit rating goes down and the bank, basically has to underwrite and eat off a loss and everything. And eventually it gets sold off to somebody else for pennies on the dollar, who will go and try to collect on it, because it's been delinquent for more than 90 days at that point. And they'll try and try and try and try and try to collect. And yeah, so anyways, you can have a scenario unfurl where the government is spending like a drunken, whore, and yet the velocity of money goes into free fall and prices are forced down because it's no longer circulating in the system and credit gets tight. And that's what grinds me with the frustration is that I look out on a market that doesn't understand any of this. It hears phrases like debt bomb and it thinks that when it explodes, it leads to the value of the dollar plummeting in value because the explosion pushes it down. But the reality is the explosion pushes it up. And this is what it's just people don't get this. They just the fundamental misunderstanding that's happened all over the place is exactly this. They don't understand liquidity shocks. They don't understand what happens when when there just isn't enough money circulating in the system and when the velocity of money collapses. I mean, in essence, you can have massive, massive interventions done by the government and the Fed in the economy, and yet inflation will be fucking anemic. As I pointed out, 3% last year. 3%. That is not that much. That's not that significant at all. And I guess that is ultimately my frustration is that I see a scenario where the government is spending and spending and spending, and it is trying to go with option 3. It is trying to devalue the underlying asset that the debt it owes, and everything. But I also see a world where we are pushing more, where in essence the number of supplies, the number of the amount of inventory available to be purchased has not fallen significantly. It hasn't gone down and everything, and yet people have gone further and further into debt, and yet there are still exactly the same amount of goods and services to purchase. And I mean, my headache in all this, people they because all they have lived through is inflation, 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 inflation. They don't see any of it coming. It's all. Everything has to yield to inflation. Even if there's a credit crunch, that will mean inflation, and that's not true. When, like I said, when credit gets tight, do you go out and find a way around it? Do you find a way to circumvent the fact that you can't get that auto loan? No, you just decide to go without a car. You carpool with somebody else. You don't, go out and find a way to circumvent the fact that the bank won't lend you the money anymore. Or you decide to suck it up and buy the car 2 years later as you start saving up for it, to buy it without them and everything. And then that money, the car that you were expecting to get now, you end up getting 2 years up the road. Like you just don't. You don't go out and find some way to circumvent it. You just go without the car that you thought you were going to finance on the back of the bank, and so that lowers the circulation of money because now your money isn't going to the car dealership, which at the car dealership they go out and spend it something else that they need and everything, and their marginal propensity to consume comes into effect. But I mean, again, the problems that exist with this analysis is, essentially people think, credit tightens, then the value of the dollar is worse. And that's not true. When credit tightens, it becomes a liquidity vacuum. When it becomes difficult to get a loan, there isn't as much money circulating in the system and everything. And when the Fed hikes interest rates, it vacuums up a lot of the currency that was available to circulate in the system in order to stimulate asset prices, really, at the end of the day. So we have seen, where we have seen the inflation that has happened, it makes sense. The inflation that we've seen the most of has been in stock prices, in the price of assets. Where we haven't seen much, really, has been on the price of goods and services. And we have not seen any sort of collapse at this point in the supply of goods and services and low inventory levels and everything. Inventory levels have crept back up, and you're highly indebted. And if we define deflation as what happens when there's less money in existence to chase the goods and services that are available in existence, then debt has a pernicious negative effect if the amount of goods that are sloshing around in the system doesn't go down, in proportion to the debt rising. And that's exactly what's happening. As people push further and further into debt, as households go further and further into debt, at some point the bill is going to come due and they're going to have to start making the payments, which means that they will stop shopping, stop buying goods and services, and you know, the effect of this will be a negative on, the consumer price index. It'll have negative effects on it. It'll push it down rather than up and everything. And, you know, there's an iron law of the universe when it comes to money, which is a law that can't be broken, and it doesn't matter if you believe in it or not. And that is called, in order for money to cause inflation, it has to be circulating in the system. And if you have massive expansions in the money supply, you can have prices go sideways rather than up if you're in a scenario where the velocity of money goes into free fall. Again, the Austrians redefined inflation to mean an expansion in the money supply. I define it as a rise in the price of goods and services. Now, they have gone up, but they haven't gone up as much as the rounds of quantitative easing pushed them up. Quantitative easing made sure that there were 3.13%, three times, and another tenth and a third of a tenth, basically up, like out of scale, out of proportion, fundamentally. Prices aren't up 313% since 2007. That's just not, doesn't square with the reality that any of us have lived through. And so there's a hole here, and that hole has to be the velocity of money. A dollar is just not, it doesn't have the same, effect to spend a dollar into the system as it once did. Money isn't moving around, it's not changing hands as frequently as it used to, And so, I do find myself in this state of frustration. So, the government will spend and spend and spend and spend. It's addicted to spending. And another problem that I have with all of it is that the technology is getting better and better. I mean, think about your cell phone. You used to need to have a calendar. Some of us still do. You used to need to have an alarm clock. Maybe some of us do, but some of us don't. And you used to need to have a flashlight, All these functions are now baked into our cell phones, and now we have no more need to do these things with, any of those things. I don't need an alarm clock anymore on my desk that has a radio in it, because I can just have my phone wake me up. And, all those jobs that would have been created when I went out and bought the flashlight and alarm clock are now no longer going to be created because I have all that functionality in my cell phone, and that reality exists, and robotics are getting better and better and better, and AI is getting better and better and better, which is going to make one engineer able to do the work of five. He'll be significantly augmented at his job and being able to be much more productive. Productivity increases by massive amounts, and the inventory levels start creeping up, and yet people are so in debt and everything that they are not able to buy these goods, this inventory as it's created, which means the people that are behind it are eventually going to have to ask for less for the fucking amount of goods and services that they bought. And this fundamental misunderstanding, I don't know why it exists. I don't know why people don't get this. I mean, if I'm a bank and a bunch of my customers have stopped paying, for their debt, and my bank hasn't failed, then I'm going to tighten lending practices up. And whenever credit tightens up, it's essentially gone into a credit crunch. And at that point, money circulates much more slowly in the system. People are less able to go out and get auto loans. They're much less able to go out and spend on credit cards and push themselves further and further and further and further into debt. They're much less able to go on vacations. they were planning to go on. They're much less able to do all these discretionary things that they thought they were going to do and that they wanted to do, And so goods and services, when they're much less able to do that, they have less demand for those goods and services, which, yes, I mean, it's true ultimately that when there's less demand for a product, prices don't instantly collapse. It's not like they're monitoring everything so that they're seeing demand has fallen and they're monitoring it so closely that they see it instantly. First it shows up in the data and they don't react to it. They get a little, well, that's disappointing and everything. But eventually, reality is that, stuff hasn't moved for so long, they just start to get desperate and they start to lower prices in order to just move inventory out the door. And that's essentially what happens. And I can foresee a scenario unfolding. We're not there yet, but where the mounting deflationary pressures in the system start to overwhelm the government's ability to devalue the currency because they are getting stronger. Household debt being as high as it is and credit card debt and auto loan delinquencies being as high as they are is a deflationary signal. These forces can't help but be deflationary because no matter what happens when it comes to debt, either demand slows down because people start paying it down, or the banker finds themselves in a situation where they don't get paid, and so they decide, at Visa to go and sell unnecessary. First, they might dip into the stocks that Visa owns because they'll have money on the side, they'll have this on the side, and they'll go and it'll be office furniture will be replaced with cheaper office furniture where they sell their good stuff off onto the market. They'll find anything they can sell around the office, which will increase the supply of money, and while at the same time, the money circulating in the system starts to collapse. So they push more inventory on the system and less money is now chasing the inventory that's available and everything. And so, that has a deflationary effect. I don't understand why people don't get this. They still think, the U.S. dollar is it's toilet paper. It's not, it's worthless basically. There's still that attitude amongst Americans that don't understand this stuff. They don't get it. When debt has a negative effect on price levels. It can't help but have a negative effect on price levels. I mean, what does credit do? Now, if I go out and I have a credit card and I start spending on it, hypothetically as the person that isn't the banker, eventually, if I'm a responsible person, I'm going to have to cut back on the things that I'm using my disposable income to buy, because now I have to redirect that money towards paying off the credit card debt that I'm now in. And that means that I have less money to go and spend chasing goods and services or even assets of any kind. And so this, whether or not a person defaults on the debt and doesn't pay it, or they do, it doesn't matter. It still has, either way, a negative effect on price levels. And I don't understand why people don't get this. They talk about it, and you'll get into discussions about the debt bomb going up, and they'll think, this is going to destroy this is going to destroy your currency. It's going to become worthless, because the government is printing so much of it. But again, the Bank of Japan printed huge amounts of money. Their debt to GDP now is like 3, and it's because, Japan printed a bunch of stimulus out the fucking ass on the Japanese people. They vomited so much of it onto the system, and yet the inflation that was a result of all of it was anemic. It was very low and everything, unexpectedly low for the amount of drunken spending that the government was going on. And, so you had a scenario where the value of the yen was relatively, stable, but it was increasing, and yet tons and tons of more, money printers were going burr, printing yen like crazy. You had huge expansion to the yen supply, and yet, the price of the yen went up. And that can happen. I know that it flies in the face of all common sense to think this, but it's there in the data, and the reason why it's this way is that money printer going burr doesn't necessarily lead to a scenario where the money that they've pushed onto the system starts circulating in the system. You know, money being created doesn't necessarily become money being circulated. Money being created flows into liquidity traps. It doesn't flow into the real economy. It circulates into, stocks, bonds, you know, other things, but it doesn't circulate into the demand for goods and services.